In this video, I will show you the texture baking workflow for complex objects which have multiple materials. So recently I've been working on this Mars Rover Blender artwork, and I do plan on creating like a time-lapse creation process video where I show you the overall process of how I created the Mars Rover. So when that video is released, I'll have the link in the description. But after I finished the artwork, I wanted to sell the Mars Rover as a 3D model on the different 3D marketplaces that I sell on, and I also wanted to upload the Mars Rover model to Sketchfab. And so in order to upload it to Sketchfab, I needed to bake the materials, because all of the different materials on the Martian rover are procedural, so I created them procedurally using Blender shader nodes. But Blender's procedural materials don't work in other 3D software, and they don't work on Sketchfab, and they don't work in game engines. They are procedural materials, so they only work inside of Blender. So if you've created a 3D model that you want to use in a game engine, or maybe use on Sketchfab, or use in another 3D program, but you've used procedural materials in Blender, then you need to texture bake out the materials to texture maps, and then they can work in another 3D program. But I do know that texture baking in Blender can be quite confusing, especially if you have a very complex object, or you have an object with multiple materials like I do here on this Martian rover wheel. And so hopefully people out there will benefit from this video who are trying to do similar things with their models. And just in case anyone out there wants to follow along using the same exact model that I'm using, then I will have a free download of the project files on my Gumroad store and Patreon page with the link in the description, and you can download the free project files of the rover wheel, and then you can follow along with the tutorial and bake the textures. Or of course you can use your own 3D model and bake the textures. And also real quick, I did want to mention that the Martian lighting that I'm using in this scene is from the Physical Starlight and Atmosphere Blender add-on, and I created a review video of that Blender add-on. Link is in the description if you'd like to check it out. And I do also have an affiliate link to the product on Blender Market, so if you'd like to purchase the Physical Starlight and Atmosphere add-on, if you use my affiliate link, then I'll earn a small commission, and that's a great way to help support me. And I am trying to create Blender tutorials and Blender content for a living, so if you'd like to help support me and this channel, I will have links in the description to my Gumroad store and my Patreon page and the YouTube memberships, and I do appreciate your support. So here is the Mars rover model that I created, and in this video I'm just going to go over the process of baking one of the wheels, because I'm going to be texture baking the different parts of the rover with different texture maps. So I'm going to have a separate material for like the base of the rover, then I'll have a separate material for the front cockpit of the rover, and then also like these legs here going from the rover to the wheels. That's going to be a separate texture bake as well with different texture maps. But depending on your object, you might just want to do one texture bake with all of the object combined. Now the first thing that I did is I joined all of these different objects together. So when I was modeling the wheels, this part up here was like a different object, then these dark pieces were a different object, and also the bolts were a different object, and then also like these metal pieces here in the center were different objects. And so before I start baking the textures, I wanted this entire rover wheel to be its own object. But if you want to have multiple objects and bake them all to the same texture maps, then you can totally do that, and the workflow is very similar. And if that's what you want to do for your object, then you might be interested in checking out this video here on how to bake multiple materials to the same texture maps. And in that tutorial, I created a throwing hatchet 3D model, and the wooden handle for the hatchet is a separate object from the metal hatchet head. And in that video, I show you how to bake the materials to the same texture maps while keeping the object separate. So if that's what you want to do, you could also check out that video, but the workflow is pretty much the same. Now, before I was able to join these objects together, I had to make sure the modifiers were the same, because if you join two objects together which have different modifiers, it's going to override all the other modifiers and just use the modifiers from the last object that you selected before you join them together. So I had to go through these objects and apply certain modifiers, but I wanted all of the parts of the wheel to have the mirror modifier, so it mirrors it to the other side of the rover, and then I also wanted all the pieces to use the bevel modifier as well. So I applied like the array modifier, which was arraying this around the wheel, and I also applied some mirror modifiers going back and forth and things like that, but I just kept the mirror modifier in the bevel, and then I joined all of these objects together, so they are now one object. object. And then I also clicked on this button right here just to hide the mirror modifier from our view. So it's still there, but I'm just hiding it from our view so we can just focus on this single object. Now, even though this wheel is one object now, there are still many different materials. There is the outer tires material, and that's like the material up here. Then there's also the inner tires material. Then I also have the tires dark, and that's this dark material here, which is around the wheels. And then I also have the metal wheel structure material, and that's these metal pieces which are going up and down. And then I also have a metal bolts material, and those are those bolts which are around the wheel. And so I'm going to texture bake all of these materials to the same texture maps, and then we can delete all of these different materials. We can add one single material for the entire wheel, and then we can add in the baked textures. Now, the textures that I'm going to be baking in this video are the color map, the metallic map, the roughness map, and the normal map. Those are the different material inputs that I need for this wheel. So the first step for texture baking this object is to create a blank image texture, and we're going to bake the materials onto that image texture. So I'm in the shading tab right here. So I have the 3D space over here, and I'm in the material preview. And then right over here on this window, I have these shader nodes. And I'm going to first select the outer tires because this is the first material in all of the materials on this object. So I'm going to press Shift A. And let's go right here to the search, and I'm going to search for an image texture node. And I'm going to drop the image texture node right here, just kind of place it above the shader. So we now need to click on new to create a new image texture. So I'm going to click on the new button. Now right here on the name, I'm just going to call this Rover Wheels. Now on the width and height here, this is going to be the resolution. So I want to make this a 4K texture. So I'm going to click and then drag down and then let go, and that'll change both values at the same time. Now on default, this is a 1K texture, but I want to times this by 4 so that it is a 4K texture. So what I'm going to do is click on the star button on the keyboard, and then I'm going to type 4. So this is telling Blender to times this number by 4. And then I'm going to hit enter, and the resolution is going to be 4096 by 4096. And that is very standard for a 4K texture. Now on the color here, I can just leave this at the default, which is black, because the texture baking is going to go on top of the blank color. So now I'm going to click on the OK button, and that is going to create the image texture. So the next step is to UV unwrap the geometry to this image texture. So to do this, I'm going to click right up here when the crosshair appears here in the corner, and I'm going to click and drag down. And this is going to split the window. So I can now just click right here to change the editor type, and I'm going to change this to the UV editor. Now, if I scroll right over here, I want to preview the Rover wheels right here in the background. So I'm going to click on the drop down right here, and I have a bunch of different textures from the project that I was working on. So I'm just going to search for it. So I'm going to type in Rover wheels, and here is the Rover wheels. So I can see this says Rover wheels, and so it's the same one as this right here. Now I did already UV unwrap this object, but just to show you, I'm going to re-UV unwrap this. So for an object like this, I am just going to use the Smart UV project. So I'm going to tab into edit mode here in the 3D space, and then I'm going to press the A key to select everything. I'm now going to press the U button, and the U button is going to bring up the UV map settings. And I am going to use the Smart UV project. So I'm just going to click on Smart UV project. Now I want to give this island margin a very small value. And what this is going to do is it's going to give a tiny little bit of space between the islands, and that way when we bake the textures, there's not going to be any overlapping of the textures. So I am going to use an island margin of 0.0005. You can UV unwrap this again and play around with the island margin, but a 0.0005 works good for me. So I'm going to click on OK. And so now it's UV unwrapped it. And if I zoom in here, you can see that there is a tiny little space between all the faces here in the UV editing. And so this way, when we bake the textures, that little space here will ensure that the texture doesn't overlap any of the other faces. And if you'd like to learn the basics of UV unwrapping in Blender, then I do have a beginner tutorial on UV unwrapping. I'll have a link in the description if you'd like to check out that beginner tutorial on UV unwrapping. So this UV unwrap will work great for what I'm doing. So I'm now going to press the tab key to go back to object mode. So we've now UV unwrapped the geometry to this Rover wheels image. And so when we bake the materials, Blender will actually know where to bake the material to the flat image texture. So now let's go over the baking settings. So I'm going to click right up here on the render properties, and to bake the textures, you need to make sure you're in the the Cycles rendering engine. The Eevee rendering engine doesn't support baking, so if you are using Eevee in your Blender file, that's totally fine. You just need to switch to Cycles, then you can do the texture baking, and then once the texture baking is done, you can switch back to Blender Eevee. So just make sure you're using the Cycles render engine for now. So the next thing that we're going to do is open up the sampling tab. Now I'm going to be using a render samples of 10. So if you open up the sampling tab, you can open up the render tab, and I'm just going to turn the sampling to 10. And why I'm turning this to 10 is because the baking process actually uses samples. So if you turn the samples up, then it's going to take much longer to bake, but if you turn the sampling down, it's going to bake much quicker. And so I find that just 10 samples works fine for texture baking, and I find that it doesn't affect the quality at all. So I'm just going to use a sample count of 10. That way it should texture bake very quickly. Of course, it will also depend on how powerful your computer is. So I'm going to now close the sampling tab, and I'm going to open up the baking tab. And the baking tab is normally like right down here, but because I'm doing texture baking, I just clicked on these little dots here and I brought it way up here to the top. So I'm just going to open up the baking tab. Now before we start baking, it's very important to turn off any metallic values that you have in your material. So I'm just going to click right back over here to the material properties. So what I'm going to do is just click through these materials and take a look at all the materials. So I can see the outer tires doesn't have any metallic value, the inner tires doesn't have any metallic value as well, and also the tires dark has no metallic value. However, these two last materials have metallic maps. So the metal wheel structure, this is a metallic material, and so I'm using this color ramp right here from the noise texture, and so this way some parts are going to be metallic and then other parts are going to be less metallic. And then also right here on the metal bolts, I wanted the bolts to be fully metallic, so on the principled shader I just turned the metallic value to 1. Now the problem with texture baking metallic maps is that the metallic areas are going to be fully black, and so what you need to do in Blender is you need to turn the metallic values to 0, then you need to texture bake the material, and then you can turn the metallic value back up. And I'll also show you how to bake the metallic textures as well. So you just need to go through all of the materials on your object, and you need to turn the metallic value to 0. So on the metal bolts here, I need to turn the metallic value to 0 on the principled shader, and then I'm also going to click on the metal wheel structure, and the metal wheel structure is using a texture for the metallic value, but again, if I bake the material with some metallic values, then the metallic area is going to be fully black and the textures are not going to look proper. So I need to unplug this from the metallic value, and then I need to turn the metallic value all the way to 0. So make sure you go through your materials and make sure the metallic value is turned to 0. Alright, so the first map that I'm going to bake is the color map. So because I have 5 different materials, I need to texture bake all of the materials to the same texture map. So if I click on the outer tires, the first material, we have the Rover wheels image. And so what I need to do is I need to copy and paste this image into all of the different materials. So I'm going to select this image texture and I'm going to press Ctrl C to copy it. Then I'm going to click on the inner tires and I'm going to press Ctrl V to paste it. Then I'm going to click on the tires dark and again I'll press Ctrl V. And I'm going to do that for all the materials. So the next one, Ctrl V to paste that. And the last one here, Ctrl V to paste that. So now if I click through all of these materials have the Rover wheels image in the material. So now that we've set that up, let's go right back over here to the render properties and open up the baking tab right here. So I'm going to be baking the color map first. So right here on the bake type, we need to click on diffuse because diffuse and color are the same thing. So click on the diffuse. Now on default in the influence tab, the direct, indirect, and color are all going to be turned on, but we actually want to turn off the direct and indirect because if you leave these on, it's actually going to texture bake the lighting into the image, but we don't want to texture bake the lighting, we just want to bake the color and then we will use the lighting from our 3D scene to actually light the material. So we want to turn off the direct and indirect. We just want to leave the color one turned on because we are just baking the color of the texture. So we are almost ready to bake the material. Now before you hit the bake button, there is just a few things to go over to make sure it bakes properly. So the first thing that you need to do is make sure the object is selected. I know that does seem obvious, but just make sure the object is selected to make sure it actually bakes the correct object. Now the next really important thing is to make sure this image texture is selected in all of these materials, because by selecting the image texture, we're telling Blender that we want to bake the material to that image texture. So make sure you have the image texture node selected with the Rover wheels image, and you know it's selected because it has a white outline. So I'm going to go right back over here to the material properties, and I'm just going to click through these, and I'm just going to make sure that the Rover wheels image is selected, and that is very important so that Blender knows where to bake it to. So we can now click right back over here to the render properties. And then I also like to leave the image editor or the UV editor right up here, and this way I can actually see the texture as it's baking. And then I also always press Ctrl S just to save my Blender file, and then I'm going to click on the bake button. And you can see right down here it is baking, and it shouldn't take very long, it's almost done already. And so because we had this object selected, it's going to go through all of the materials and it's going to bake all the textures from each material. And you can see it finished. So to preview this in the full screen, I'm going to hold down the Control key and then click on the space bar, and I can zoom in here. And you can see that it's gone through and it's baked all of the different materials. And if I press the Tab key to go into edit mode, you can see that all of the UV editing is aligned up with those images. And also if I zoom in here, you can see this is why the island margin is really important, because I don't want the texture baking to overlap the other parts of the UV editing. So that is important that you give it a little bit of island margin to make sure that each one of these islands in the UV editing has a little bit of space. So I'm going to press the Tab key to go back to object mode. So we now need to save this image to a file on our computer, because if you don't save it to an image file on your computer, then Blender's not going to save the image data, and so if you close Blender, it's going to lose your baking. So to save this image, you're going to click right up here on image, and then you're going to click on save as. And so I've created a folder called Rover Wheel Texture Maps, and I'm going to save all the 4 texture maps in this folder. Now if you press the N key to open up the side panel, I am going to use the JPEG image format, and this way it's going to compress the image a little bit, but the image will still look high quality. It's just going to compress the image so that the image is a little bit smaller file size. And then right here on the bottom, I'm going to rename this to Rover Wheels Color, because this is the color map. So Rover Wheels Color, and then I can click on Save as Image. All right, so that is the first one, and we've saved this, so we now need to create the other images. Now something that's really important with all of the other images is to make sure the color space right here is set to non-color. And why you need to set all the other images to non-color is because they're not actually contributing to the final base color of the material. So the metallic map, the roughness map, and the normal map is not actually affecting the base color, and so we do need to make sure the color space is set to non-color. If you don't set this to non-color, then the colors are going to look kind of weird, and the metallic maps are going to be messed up, and also the roughness maps aren't going to look correct. They're going to be a different roughness value, so it is important that you change this to non-color. Now because this is the same exact image, if I click right down here and click on all of these other materials, you can see the color space was changed to non-color on all the other images. So just make sure you click through all of the other materials and just make sure this says non-color. But because this is the same image, when I change it to non-color, it's going to change it within all the different materials. So I'm now going to bake the metallic map. Now baking the metallic maps is a little bit more complex, but I will show you how to do it. So the outer tires material, the inner tires material, and the tires dark material, none of those are using metallic values. So that is fine, I can just leave these how they are. However, the wheel structure and the metal bolts do have metallic values. But as I said earlier, if you turn the metallic value all the way to 1, then the texture is just going to be fully black and it's not going to bake correctly. And also, if I click right up here on the render properties and go back to the bake settings, if I go here to the bake type, you can see that there actually isn't any metallic value to bake to. There's the roughness, there's the diffuse, and there's also the normal, but there is actually no metallic value. So instead, we are going to use the emission. So just change the bake type to the emit, and that is short for emission. And then we do also need to use the Node Wrangler add-on. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled, you can just click right up here on edit, and then you can go to the preferences, and then you can click right over there on the add-ons tab, and you can go to the search and search for Node Wrangler and just check checkmark the Node Wrangler add-on. And we're going to use the Node Wrangler add-on to bake the metallic image texture. So now that the Node Wrangler is enabled, I need to preview the metallic value. So if I click right back over here to the material properties, you can see here is the metal wheel structure. And this color ramp was going into the metallic value. So what I'm going to do in the shader nodes is I'm going to hold down the Control and Shift key, and then I'm going to select the color ramp. And that is using the feature of the Node Wrangler by Control Shift and clicking on different nodes. And it's going to add this viewer node, and it's going to preview the node on the object. And if I click on the arrow to open up the viewer node is actually an emission material. So because we changed the bake type over to emission, it's actually going to bake whatever the viewer node is previewing. So just make sure you Control Shift and select whatever node is being used for the metallic material. So I'm now going to click on the metal bolts material, and you can see with the metal bolts material, there isn't actually a texture going into the metallic value. I want the bolt material to be completely metallic. So I want all of the bolts to completely be metal. So I'm not actually using any image textures. So to fix this, I can just use an RGB value. So I'm going to press Shift A, and I'm going to go here to the search, and I'm going to search for RGB, and I'm just going to add the RGB node. Now, if I plug the color into the metallic, I can zoom in here and take a look at the bolts. And if I turn the RGB color all the way up to fully white, you can see the bolts are completely metallic. But if I turn this color all the way down to fully black, they're not going to be metallic at all. So because I want the bolts to be completely metallic, I'm going to turn this up to a fully white color. And then to be able to bake this properly, I need to hold down the Control and Shift key and select the RGB. And then again, we don't want any values to be going into the metallic because that's going to mess up the baking. So unplug any values from the metallic and make sure that the metallic is turned to 0. All right, so the viewer node is previewing the RGB in the metal bolts. And then also right over here in the wheel structure, the viewer node is previewing the color ramp. So we can now texture bake the metallic values. So again, we need to make sure that the image texture is selected so that Blender knows where to bake to. So again, just click through each of the materials and make sure that the image texture is selected. All right, so those are all selected. And then again, in the 3D space, make sure that your object is selected. And then we're going to click right up here on the render properties. And before I hit the bake button, I'm going to press Control S again to save the Blender file, just so that if Blender crashes for some reason, we won't lose our progress. And then the bake type is set to emission, so I'm now going to click on the bake button. And then we can preview the bake right up here, so when it finishes, it'll show up right here in the UV editor. So now if I zoom in here, you can see that most of the material is black, and so black is telling it that it's not going to be metallic, but then the white values is telling it that it is going to be fully metallic. So we can now save this image. So just like the other image, I'm going to click right up here on image, and then I'm going to click on save as. And then I need to rename this image. So instead of this being called Rover Wheels Color, I'm going to rename this to Rover Wheels Metallic. And then again, I will save this as a JPEG image, and I'm going to click on save as. All right, so we've saved the second image. So now we are going to do the roughness. So again, right here on the Rover Wheels image, we need to make sure that the color space is set to non-color because the roughness values are not contributing to the final base color. So now that we've finished baking the metallic values, we need to get rid of the viewer node. So I'm going to hold down the Control and Shift key and select the principled shader. That's just going to preview the principled shader again, but we still need the metallic values to be set to 0 so that it doesn't mess up any of the baking. So just Control Shift and select the principled shader. Then I'm going to select the other metal material, and I can Control Shift and select the principled shader, and then just make sure the metallic value is still set to 0. So we are now going to bake the roughness maps. So I'm going to click on the first material. Now, because we are baking the roughness maps, we again need the color space to be set to non-color. So just make sure this is still set to non-color. And I'm setting this to non-color because the roughness maps aren't contributing to the final base color. So it does need to be set to non-color so it bakes properly. So now I'm just going to click through all the materials and just make sure the Rover Wheels image is selected. So I need to select it there and also select it there. And then again, just make sure the correct object is selected. So I'm now going to go right back over here to the render properties, and right here on the bake type, I can change this to roughness, and this is going to tell Blender to bake the roughness maps. So I can now press Control S again to save, and then I can click on bake again, and it's going to bake it to the same image. So we'll just wait for this to finish. It usually doesn't take very long, and it's finished. So here is the roughness map. So the dark values and light values are going to tell the material whether it's going to be more reflective or more rough. So we now just need to save this image. So again, let's click on image and I'm going to click on save as. Now this one I need to rename to roughness. So right here on the Rover wheels, I'm going to rename this to Rover wheels roughness. And then on the file format, again, I'm going to use JPEG. And then I will click on save as image. All right, so we just have one left, and that is the normal map. So again, the normal map isn't contributing to the final base color. So you need to make sure that the non-color is selected in the color space of the image. And then again, you just need to click through here and make sure that the Rover wheels image is selected. So just make sure that image texture is selected and then make sure the object is selected. So then right here on the bake type, I need to click on this and I need to change this to normal. And this is going to tell Blender to bake the normal maps. And then again, I'll press Ctrl S to save, and then let's click on the bake button again, and it's going to bake the normal map to this image. And it's finished. So if I just zoom in here, you can see that normal map, and so that's going to make the material look like it has a little bit of bump. So we need to save this image. So again, let's click on image, and I'm going to click on save as. And then I need to rename this image. So this one is going to be called Rover wheels normal because it is the normal map. And then again, I will just save this as a JPEG in the folder with my other image textures, and I'll just click on save as image. All right, so the texture baking is finished. Now, before I delete all of the procedural materials, I do just want to make a backup of this just in case something went wrong with the texture baking. I can come back to it and I won't have everything deleted. So what you can do is you can click on file and then you can click on save as. And then I'm just going to increment the save. So I'm basically just duplicating the Blender file, but it's going to save the same data. So I'm just going to click on this plus right here, and that is going to add a number to the end of the Blender file. And then I'm going to click on save as. And so now that I have a backup of this Blender file, I can delete all of the materials. So I'm going to click right over here to the material properties, and I'm going to click on the minus button, and that's going to get rid of the materials. So just click on the minus button to get rid of all of the materials. So we can now create a new single material, and then we will add in the baked image textures. So I'm going to click on new here, and I can just rename this material to Rover wheels baked. So Rover wheels baked. So to add in all the image textures that we baked, I'm going to be using the principled texture setup, and that is a feature from the Node Wrangler add-on, and we did turn on the Node Wrangler add-on earlier in this video. So with the Node Wrangler enabled, I'm going to select the principled BSDF shader, and then I can press Ctrl-Shift-T. And that is going to bring up Blender's file browser, and then I just need to press the A key to select all the images. So just go into the folder where you saved all the images. So we have the color, the roughness, the normal, and the metallic. Just make sure you have all of them selected, and then click on Principled Texture Setup. And what this is going to do is it's going to find the names in the texture, and it's going to add these in properly. So because we have the color, metallic, roughness, and normal in each of the names, it can detect which images these are, and so it's plugged them up properly. And then also something really important that it's done is it's set the color space to non-color on the normal, the roughness, and the metallic. However, the base color is contributing to the final base color, so this one needs to be set to sRGB. And I can go into the rendered view and preview the final material. So this is the final material with the baked textures. And if I wanted to preview any of these textures, I could Control-Shift and select the different textures, and that's going to preview it. And just to confirm that this is all working properly, I uploaded this model to Sketchfab, and I imported all the textures, and you can see this works great. So I will be uploading the Rover 3D model to Sketchfab, so when that is released, I'll have the link in the description. And also when the full Mars Rover creation process video is posted, I'll have the link to that in the description. So that's it for this tutorial, so I hope you found this helpful, and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to help support me and this channel, then I will also have links in the description to my Gumroad store and my Patreon page and the YouTube memberships. So I hope you found this video helpful, and thank you for watching.